So, Scream is still a thing, huh? Okay. I'm sure this was a coincidence, but it seems very odd to me that in the last few months we've had not one, not two, but three big movies that were trying to revive old franchises in very similar ways. And now here we are with Scream, or Scream 5, or whichever number it is, which kind of feels like the culmination of that. Because the best way I can describe this movie is that it's part Ghostbusters Afterlife, part Matrix Resurrections. It's trying to be a loving tribute to Scream that pays homage to the lore and the characters in a respectful way, while at the same time reaching so far for a new idea to base the movie on that it goes off the rails and turns into something I'm not sure if the fans are going to be on board with. Now, I wouldn't call myself a Scream fan. The first one was alright. I thought the ending was bullshit, and generally it's not as clever as it thinks it is, but it was amusing enough, and I don't really have any ill will towards it. And then all the sequels have been mediocre to bad in my opinion. So I don't really know why we needed another one, especially when you already lampooned horror movie remakes with the last sequel. So what else is there now? Well, apparently there's requels, a term I really hope doesn't become a thing. This new fad Hollywood's getting into where you bring back old franchises as sort of a part reboot, part sequel, part continuation that picks up the story where it left off and brings back the legacy characters, but also introduces new things and new characters at the same time so you can have your cake and eat it too. And that might have actually been an interesting idea worth exploring, but they didn't stop there. Because in addition to that, they also made the movie about fandoms and the fans' reactions to said reboots and requels, both positive and toxic. The movie's trying to be this big self-aware meta-commentary deconstruction of that whole process and how Hollywood keeps pumping these things out without respecting the franchises and the stories and what they mean to people. And I think that works a lot better in a movie like Scream than it did in Matrix Resurrections, because Scream was always about being kind of meta and self-aware with this stuff. So even though I don't have much of an attachment to the franchise, there was potential for them to do some cool things here. So I was intrigued. And they really go all in with it. They dissect the whole nature of the requel and how fans tend to feel about these things, what makes a good one and why some of them don't work, how you have to bring back the legacy characters respectfully and do something meaningful with them, but also introduce new characters and new concepts that fans won't reject, so you've got enough nostalgia for longtime fans and enough new stuff for newer fans that you're covering every single base. And that's good, but they also talk about why movies that try to be hard reboots of franchises that jettison all the lore and history have become so hated, and the fan backlash to reboots and requels when they're done badly or carelessly, and this is where it gets more complicated. References are made to the new Halloween movies and the Child's Play reboot and how Ghostbusters 2016 tanked and how Rian Johnson destroyed Star Wars with The Last Jedi. There's even a conversation about how for Hollywood these are just movies, but for a fan, the movie a reboot or requel shits on could represent the happiest memories of their childhood and whatnot, so it's special to them for reasons that aren't often appreciated. And a lot of this is actually pretty clever. They had a good idea to base the movie on that made sense in the context of the film. They got my attention with that. So all they needed now was a good story and to take their own advice about introducing some new characters that don't suck and doing something respectful with the legacy and the fans. And that's where I think they got a little too fancy with this. The legacy characters make out pretty well here. They're treated with reverence, their history is respected, although Dewey does very noticeably draw the short straw. Yeah, the male character. Big surprise, right? I hate to say it, but I felt like Dewey got Han Solo'd here, which is a big red flag in a movie that's trying to be very self-aware about why certain requels draw fan backlash. Sidney and Gale are treated well, though. Throughout the movie, they're written like people who know what they're doing because they've been through this so many times. When the newbies are freaking out, Sidney and Gale are very calm and know exactly what to do. Dewey gets a moment like that where he immediately starts sizing up all the potential suspects and knows exactly who to be suspicious of. And Sidney especially comes off like a total pro because she's an old hat at this. And the film even jumps through a lot of hoops to include other aspects of the lore. You see other legacy characters making cameos, relatives of some of the old characters who died. In fact, two of the new characters are the niece and nephew of Randy, which I thought was kind of cool. cool. Now, there are parts that lean too heavily on nostalgia. The opening scene is cut and pasted from the original movie, they reuse some of the old set pieces, and to their credit, they're self-aware about that too, because this is something that tends to happen a lot in requels. There's even a line in the climax where Sidney calls Ghostface out for this. "You really brought me back here? You must be the most derivative Ghostface yet. At least the other ones had imagination." And in a different movie, pointing this out wouldn't give you a pass for doing it yourself, but because Scream has always been about this type of stuff, it kind of works. So the nostalgia factor, while not perfect, could have been a lot worse. And they even dedicated the movie to Wes Craven. So in terms of respecting the legacy of Scream, I think they're good in that department. The rest of it is where they run into problems. The new cast are a mixed bag. There were probably more that I liked than disliked, but new Sidney is easily the worst actor in the entire thing. She gets most of the worst lines, and her backstory requires some soft retconning that I felt a little bit iffy about. Also, the writers were clearly too focused on the meta commentary and not focused enough on the actual story, because the story is not as good as the movie thinks it is. From very early on, I was 100% sure that I knew who Ghostface was and what the big twist was going to be, and I did. It's very, very obvious. And the reasoning for this, I think, is that they wanted to keep the nostalgia factor at the forefront, but really, it just made things feel predictable and unoriginal. But I wanted to give them some leeway, because things were being handled respectfully for the most part. Some of the scares were pretty decent if that's what you're seeing it for, and I did want to see where they were going with the commentary angle. So I was kind of with them up until the climax. Unfortunately, the climax is where everything falls apart. Once Ghostface is revealed and you find out what the point of all this has been, everything in the movie starts to make less sense. Various things and events that I thought were going to tie together suddenly don't. Certain kills now feel very random, like they were done for no reason, or there was a reason but the reason was stupid, and other scenes now feel like they exist just to pad the runtime. You've got one character running around with a gunshot wound in their stomach like it's no big deal. They don't even need medical attention. The identity of Ghostface retroactively makes the biggest death in the movie feel like bullshit, because now you're wondering how the hell did get overpowered by this person. But the weakest part by far is Ghostface's reason for doing all this, because this is where they try to tie in the commentary about fan backlash to bad reboots and requels. So instead of Ghostface having a personal stake in these murders that's tied to story and character, which the more compelling Ghostface killers in the franchise have typically had, this time Ghostface is just there to represent toxic fans. That's why Ghostface has been doing all this. That's why the story of the movie was one of the weaker parts, because in the end, the commentary is what the writers cared about most. They wanted to deconstruct the requel and why fans react to these things the way they do, because these stories matter to them so much. But when your killer has no personal motivation to do this beyond servicing the commentary, the whole thing feels less like a story and more like a lecture. And the weird thing is, I'm not sure the writers even realized what they were doing here. I didn't get the impression that it was done in a petty or mean-spirited way, and it didn't even feel like something that didn't belong there necessarily, because like I said, Scream has always done meta stuff like this. But before, the commentary had been about the horror movies themselves. Bringing the fandom into it is a whole different beast. And at the end of the day, they still cast the fans as the killer, which felt like the biggest slap in the face they could have possibly done. And I honestly can't figure out if it was intentional or not. Were the writers so focused on the message that they let this huge pot shot at the fans slip through the cracks somehow? Did they just not understand how that would be perceived, or was that why they did it? I couldn't say. But if I could sum up this whole thing, I'll put it like this. It feels like the writers were trying really hard to high-five every Scream fan in the room. It's a big party atmosphere. Everybody who wants a high-five gets one. They're all letting their guard down, having a great time. And then one of those fans gets poked in the eye and starts bleeding and crying. And suddenly the mood changes, and no one's quite sure if this was an accident or if the writers did it on purpose for some reason, so the writers just abruptly take off, leaving everybody there, and the party ends on this really uncomfortable note. That's what this felt like. The new Scream is a movie that's really trying to have it both ways. It treats the franchise and the legacy characters with respect that feels genuine more often than not, but it also gets so carried away with the commentary and dissecting the nature of requels, the ones that respect their franchises and the ones that don't, that the story gets neglected, and the result is that one of the most insulting things a requel can do to the fans, whether intentionally or unintentionally, slips right past them and into the movie. And maybe that was the point? Most of the film did seem to have been made with good intentions, so maybe the writers had something else in mind that just didn't carry over or didn't translate. I'm not sure how it turned out the way it did, but I was rooting for the movie to stick the landing up until the last 20 minutes or so, and then this happened instead. So ironically, the filmmakers tried so damn hard to be self-aware about what makes a requel work or fail, but still couldn't get that formula right when it came time to make one themselves. Thanks so much for watching. Sound off on the new Scream movie in the comments, ding the bell icon, and follow me on social media so you can always be notified when I upload new stuff. Links to all that and to my live streaming channel are down below, and most importantly, don't forget to thumbs up the video, share, subscribe, and make sure you're still subscribed, because what really deserves to be brutally stabbed to death by a psychotic killer in a ghost face mask is the YouTube algorithm. That's all for now, but I'll be back with more soon, so stay tuned for that, do all the YouTube things, and I'll see you next time.